Today's text is commonly called the unjust steward. It is probably the least quoted and most misunderstood of all the stories that Jesus told. But Jesus, quite often in teaching, told one story after another, as we have heard over the last few weeks, so that what comes before explains that story that comes after. And today's text is like that. So to get a handle on this very difficult parable of the unjust steward, we must first look at the story that comes just before it, the prodigal son. This parable of the prodigal son is an absolute festival of death. And the first death occurs right at the beginning of the story. The father, in effect, commits suicide. It took me a while to notice this fact, but once you see it, it's plain as the nose on an elephant. The younger son comes to his father and says, "Give me the portion of goods that falleth to me." In other words, he tells his father to put his will into effect, to drop dead legally, right on the spot. Obligingly enough, the father does just that. He gives the younger son his portion in cash. And to the elder brother, presumably, he gives the farm. Thus, in just 2 sentences into the parable, Jesus has set up the following dynamics. He has given the younger son a fat living. He has made the elder brother, for all the purposes of the parable yet to come, the head of the household. And he has put the real head of the family, the father himself, out of business altogether. Next, of course, Jesus tells us that the younger son went to a far country where his rich boy's life turned rapidly into a lost cause, where he wasted his substance with riotous living. We are free, naturally, to supply any specific form of riotousness that appeals to us. Boys or booze, girls or drugs, gambling casinos at $10,000 a night. But whatever the details, the final outcome of this part of the story is that the prodigal son finally wakes up dead, reduced to the indignity of slopping hogs for a local farmer. He comes to himself one dismal morning and realizes that whatever life he had is over. Having thus introduced death into the parable a second time, Jesus proceeds to have the prodigal son come face to face with it. He sits him down next to the hog trough and has him look at his life and find nothing. The boy says, "How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger." And so, in desperation over his own inarguable death, over the end of everything that could possibly be called a life, he formulates the first version of his confession. He says, "I will arise and go to my father, and I will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and I am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants." The words, "make me as one of thy hired servants," show that while the boy may have come face to face with death, he is still far from being able to admit that he is, in fact, already dead. The boy may understand that he has died as a son, that he has, by his waywardness, lost all claims to his former status as his father's loyal child. But what he does not yet see is that as far as his relationship with his father is concerned, his lost sonship is the only life that he had. There is no way now for him to be anything but a dead son. And because he does not grasp that fact, he formulates for himself a bright new plan of his own, faking out some sort of life for himself. Life as a hired hand. In short, precisely because he cannot admit he is utterly out of business, he puts himself back into the one business that never ceases to amuse and console us, namely the bookkeeping business. How much good I've done. The boy strikes a trial balance using figures he made up and invents for himself a fake spreadsheet. Sonship he may not be able to claim. But hired handship, that may work. Maybe the old man will be senile enough to make a deal. So in one sense, the second death in the parable, the death of the prodigal son, occurs in the far country. But in the most important sense, in the sense in which he admits it to himself, it does not occur until he comes home. Listen closely, therefore, the details that Jesus now unfolds. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And so the boy makes his confession for the second time. Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. But he stops right there, full stop. No hired hand nonsense at all. The end of the subject insofar as the subject lies in his hands. And that brings us to the second thing that this parable is saying. As far as Jesus is concerned, all real confession, all confession that is not just a doctoring of our books, but a plain admission that our books are not even worth a damn, comes after forgiveness, not before. Only when, like the prodigal, we are finally confronted with the unqualified gift of someone who died in advance to forgive us no matter what, can we see that confession has nothing to do with getting ourselves forgiven. Confession is not a transaction. Confession is not a negotiation in order to secure forgiveness. It is the after the last gasp of a corpse that finally can afford to admit that it's dead and then accept resurrection. Forgiveness surrounds us, beats upon us all our lives, and we confess only to wake ourselves up to what we already have. And all of that takes us straight into the party. The Father puts no intermediate steps between forgiveness and celebration. There is none of, well, young man, you're forgiven, but let's have some good behavior now to make the deal stick. None of that ungracious talk by which we make the house of forgiveness into a penitentiary. Instead, the Father turns to his servants and bent on nothing but the party that life in his house has always been meant to be. He commands the festivities to begin. Bring forth the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring hither the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And there is the third, and if you will, the crucial death in the story, the killing of the fattened calf. Indeed, as far as I'm concerned, the fattened calf is actually the Christ figure in this parable. Consider, what does a fattened calf do? Stands around all day in its stall with one purpose in life: to drop dead at a moment's notice in order that people can have a party. And if that doesn't sound like the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world, who dies in Jesus and in all our deaths, and who comes finally to the supper of the Lamb as the main course of his own wedding party, I don't know what does. The fatted calf proclaims that the party is what the Father's house is all about. Just as Jesus, the dead and risen bridegroom, proclaims that an eternal celebration is what the universe is all about. Creation is not ultimately about religion or spirituality or morality or reconciliation or any other solemn subject. It is about God celebrating a good time and just itching to share it with you. The solemn subjects, all the little weird bells and smells and whistles and exploding snappers we pay so much attention to, are there only because we're a bunch of dummies who have to be startled into having a good time. If ever once we woke up to the fact that God finally cares only about the party, the celebration, then the solemn subjects would creep away like cats, and the truly serious subjects would be brought on. Robes, rings, shoes, wine, gold, crystal, precious stones. So now if we were to sum up the parable thus far, it would be nothing but hilariously good news. The father, the prodigal, and the fatted calf are all dead, And they are all three risen, and everyone is having a ball. Jesus puts it so succinctly. They began to be merry. But then in comes the only live character in the parable, the elder brother, Mr. Respectability. The man with volumes and volumes of the records he has kept on himself and everyone else. And as he came and drew nigh to the house, he heard music and dancing. His nostrils flare, his eyes close. He slaps the back of his right hand to his forehead. He gasps, music, dancing, levity, expense, and not a working day yet. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. He is not happy. Why this frivolity? What about the shipments that our customers wanted yesterday? Who is minding the store? And the servant said unto him, Thy brother is come, and thy father hath killed the fatted calf, because he hath received him safe and sound. The brother rants, The fatted calf? Doesn't the old fool know I've been saving that for next week's sales promotion when we show our new line of turnips? How am I supposed to run a business when he blows the entertainment budget on that loser of a son? And he was angry and would not go in. Finally, therefore, he makes a proclamation, I will not dignify this waste with my presence. Someone has to exercise a little responsibility around here. And Jesus, willing to oblige him with an important audience for all this grousing, sends him one. Therefore came his father out and entreated him. Now it's easy to stray from the main thrust of the parable at this point. The temptation for us, since the father has been grace personified to the prodigal son, is to read his reply to the elder brother's next words as more of the same tender concern. But since grace works only on the dead, this is a false start. This boy's precise problem is that he refuses to be dead to all that came before, that he's frantically trying to hold on to what passes for life. Therefore, since grace cannot possibly work on him, the only proper way to read his father's reply is as judgment, as the brandishing before him of the free saving grace of resurrection from the dead, and the condemnation of all of his laborious attempts at living. Listen to the words. And he, answering, said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment. And yet thou never gavest me a kid, that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this thy son was come, which hath devoured thy living with harlots, thou hast killed for him the fatted calf. All of which is pure, plain, self-serving tripe. Take the words thy living, for example. It wasn't the father's living anymore, because the father died to all of that at the beginning of the parable. Or take the word wasted. While it was indeed wasted, it was probably unbalanced, less of a waste than the elder brother's boring life of turnip counting. And as for the words, I've always been a good boy, and he gets veal, but I never even got goat. Well, listen to what the father says. And he said unto him, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. You silly boy, his father says. What do you mean, my living? I've been dead since the beginning of this story. What your brother wasted was his, not mine. And what you've been so smug about not wasting has actually been yours all along. Don't bellyache to me. You're in charge here, so cut out the phony baloney. If you are really dying from veal, you could have killed the fatted calf any day of the week. And if you really wanted to be ready to entertain customers at all hours of the day and night, you would have kept a dozen fatted calves on hand. Not just a single measly one you'd have to have a fit over when it gets cooked. But see, the father continues, you even get me off track. The only thing that matters is that fun or no fun, your brother finally died to all of that. And now, he's alive again. whereas you, unfortunately, were hardly alive even the first time around. Look, son, in here we're all dead, and we're having a great time. We're all lost here, and we feel right at home. You, on the other hand, are alive and miserable, and worse yet, you're standing out here in the yard as if you were some beggar. Why can't you see? You own this place, and the only reason you're not enjoying it is because you refuse to be dead to your dumb rules about how it should be enjoyed. So do yourself and everybody else a favor. Drop dead, shut up, and forget about your stupid life and go inside. Pour yourself a drink. Rejoice and be glad. Enjoy. This parable proclaims clearly that grace operates only by raising the dead. Those who think they can make their lives the basis of their acceptance by God need not apply. But it proclaims just as clearly that the judgment finally pronounced will be based only on our acceptance or rejection of our resurrection from the dead. The last judgment will vindicate everybody, for the simple reason that everybody will have passed the only test God has, namely that they are all dead and risen in Jesus. Nobody will be kicked out for having a rotten life, because nobody there will have any life but their life in Jesus. God will say to everyone, you were dead, and now you're alive. You were lost, and you're found. Put on a funny hat and come on in. If at that happy point some dumbbell really wants to try proving he really isn't dead, well, there's a place for such party poopers because God thinks of everything. At this point, most of you, if not all of you, are probably saying to yourselves, well, that's all well and good, Pastor, but what does it have to do with the unjust steward? Well, it's this. Someone once said to me at seminary that in reading or hearing a story, we tend to put ourselves in the hero position. But we would do better with the stories that Jesus tells us to put ourselves as the bad guy in the story. The parable of the unjust steward is a finger being pointed right at the Pharisees. And so perhaps today's text calls for confession. The confession that I have been an unjust steward of all the gifts the Master has given me. And if I can accept that, if I can see that, then I can recognize that I am indeed the lost sheep, the lost coin, finally the lost son, whose father throws his arms around his child and welcomes him home. Bring forth the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and shoes on his feet. And bring hither the fatted calf and kill it. And let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.